In May of 1921, a little over 100 years ago, Patrick "Patsy" Joyce fled the scene of a crime in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he wasn't even involved in the act. He was involved in a scuffle that occurred just after, but he ended up being chased and shot and killed by the police officer that had been called to the scene. The criminal act? Tossing a baseball on Sunday. By 1933, Pennsylvania law had changed to allow baseball and football between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. if a local referendum was passed to allow it. And if I followed this closely enough, to this day, that is still the law on the books in this state. And even recent attempts to overturn the law have been challenged to pass through both the State House and Senate. As recently as 2020, House Bill 1174, which proposed repealing this law about sports, was tabled. And this year, in 2023, House Bill 391, another attempt at the same repeal, has been sent to committee. There are a whole bunch of what are called blue laws, laws enacted to protect the commandment to rest and not work on Sunday. Many of these laws are still on the books in Pennsylvania, although most are unenforced. Hunting on Sunday, for example, only recently became permitted, and even then it is just on 3 designated Sundays during a year. And you will be hard-pressed to find a car dealership anywhere nearby that is open on Sunday, since Sunday automobile sales have been outlawed for decades. If you're interested, you can find the actual language for some of this in Pennsylvania Title 18, Subchapter B, Sunday Trading, which indicates that a person is guilty if any worldly employment or business is done on Sunday, except for works of necessity, charity, or wholesome recreation, which includes things like golf, swimming, boating, picnicking, that's a relief, shooting at inanimate targets, and similar healthful or recreational exercises and activities. I suspect many of us would scoff at the fact that these laws existed and in some cases still exist, although most of us probably wouldn't jump up and run out to go hunt or buy a car right this moment if the law were repealed. At least I hope not. But it is a reminder that legislating a day of rest is sort of timeless. And let's be clear, rules around practices can be very important. Rules provide important structure to help guide us and remind us to do the very things that we acknowledge we need to and want to do. Providing space for society to rest is important, and I'm not sure that would happen if we were left to our own devices. Laws create space for those with less power who might not be able to take those breaks if it weren't for requirements on employers to make it happen. Important labor laws have been instilled to create critical rest during the rhythm of the week and to provide opportunities for families to be together after a baby has been born or adopted. Policies are enacted that allow for, hopefully, both the voices and perspectives of the employers and the employee to be heard. I think we can acknowledge that some of those early blue laws had some value and good intent, although there are certainly issues of concern. For example, a Christianized focus that doesn't seem to consider other faith groups whose religious observances may fall at times other than Sunday. But the laws did provide a required break from the rigors of work and created space in the culture to honor that time of rest. It's a shame that the enforcement of the laws became more important than the original purpose of the law itself. The section of Mark chapters 2 and 3 that Rachel read are the final 2 of 5 controversial and conflict-producing events that Mark records. First, at the beginning of chapter 2, while speaking to a large crowd that had come into a home to see him, 4 friends of a paralyzed man lowered this man through the roof so that he could see Jesus. This drew the religious leaders' attention to Jesus' claim of forgiveness for this man, which then seemed to enable him to stand and walk away. Next, the Pharisees saw Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners and questioned his choices. Third, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, but Jesus' disciples were not, and he was questioned about that. And then we come to the fourth and fifth controversies, both relating to the concept of Sabbath. One of the most notable characteristics of the Gospel of Mark, which is the shortest and likely earliest written gospel account, is its urgency. And we see it here very quickly, very early in Mark's gospel, in the second and third chapter. It helps, I suppose, that Mark does not include an infancy narrative or much of a precursor to the ministry of Jesus. The gospel jumps right in with John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism in the first chapter, and we already have tension with the religious leaders by the very beginning of chapter 2, earlier than any of the other gospels. Mark also likes to use the word eutheos, often translated immediately, which helps to quickly progress this urgent tone of the narrative. This word is used probably 80-some times in the entire New Testament, and 41 of those instances are in the Gospel of Mark alone. Mark definitely keeps the narrative moving. Perhaps this magnifies the sense of power and authority that Mark wants his listeners and readers to understand that Jesus holds. Perhaps it helps put into perspective the limited time that Jesus' ministry on earth actually lasted. In any case, the final two verses of this text demonstrate the raw rub between Jesus' vision and that of the Pharisees. As Jesus restores the withered hand, the religious leaders immediately begin work to figure out how to destroy him. It's easy to read this text with our lens of Jesus as right and see his role as reinterpreting the law in a way that makes law bad, Jesus' way good. Pharisees bad, Jesus good. And this can quickly lead to anti-Semitic thoughts of Jews bad, Jesus good. Although the irony, of course, is that Jesus was Jewish. But if we go back for a moment and remind ourselves why the Sabbath was instituted, I think we might find some clarity. In Exodus, if you recall, the Sabbath was created as a set-apart time for rest for all people and all animals, to reconnect with God, who also rested, to set aside work and focus on restoration of body, of routine, even of our resources. The Sabbath was also created, as it tells us in Deuteronomy, in remembrance of the time that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and the freedom that God then provided. So if we look back at those texts and put them together with this text in Mark, and look at Mark through the lens of freedom, we might notice a different interpretation. The Sabbath doesn't mean freedom for people to do whatever the heck we want. We're talking about freedom from those things which oppress, freedom from overwork and ownership of others, freedom from systems that restrict authenticity and wholeness, freedom from partisan politics that force this or that thinking, freedom from restrictive rules that don't fully live into the essence, the ethic of the original purpose for the Sabbath, restoration and remembrance. It's easy for this kind of rule-following behavior to happen, though, isn't it? There's a comfort in establishing routines. It's important to have structure. It helps create good habits, helps limit problematic behaviors, helps guide our decisions when we come to a crossroads or an urgent choice is needed. Rules help us to remind us to do something, like take a Sabbath, and also to keep it holy by not working, by avoiding things that don't give life. But overdone structure and routine, legalistic perspectives on activity can also be problematic. I confess that The Office is my favorite television show. I often watch an episode before I go to sleep. I've seen the entire series more than once, but when I rewatch at night, I usually don't make it to the end of an episode. Mark is nodding his head. Thus why I watch it, so I can go to sleep. I know in about 25 minutes I'll be out. And last night was no different, but I did catch the beginning. I was watching season 2, the second to last episode, which is called Conflict Resolution. For those who are unfamiliar with the show, it is a mock documentary following the fictional Dunder Mifflin employees. Dunder Mifflin is a paper company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, very ordinary town, a very ordinary workplace. Two of the main characters, Jim and Dwight, are often at each other, playing pretty ridiculous, very ridiculous pranks, such as the one that was in the cold open of this particular episode. Dwight, who, if we're going to call anyone a rule follower, it's going to be Dwight, enters the office first thing in the morning to find his desk completely encompassed in yellow caution tape. Jim, whose desk is right next to Dwight's and has no caution tape, is clearly involved, but claims to know nothing about it. Dwight is distraught. What has happened? What crime occurred at his desk? Jim makes a phone call on the sly to Pam, the receptionist. She answers and transfers the call to Dwight's desk, and he is completely frozen. His phone is ringing, which, as a dutiful employee, he should answer, but also his desk is surrounded by yellow caution tape, which means he obviously cannot enter the space. Pam then tells him that the phone call is the sheriff calling to find out what's going on at his desk. Dwight is clearly caught in an existential crisis about which rule or norm to break. Not answering the phone when an official is calling, or breaking through the tape, which is obviously keeping the crime scene clear. Structure can paralyze us. Structure can render once meaningful rituals monotonous, mindless, passionless. Even the most life-giving practices, when micromanaged and legislated, can become drained of their value and goodness. Legalistic rule following often doesn't allow flexibility and options when challenges present themselves. The rules become more important than their original purpose. I'm teaching a course this semester at the college called Religion and Nonviolence, and we are beginning by watching a documentary about Gene Sharp. Sharp was a preeminent scholar in nonviolent resistance. He was a prolific theoretical author on the topic of nonviolence, and one of his most famous works was the development of a list of 198 methods of nonviolent action, things like marches, sit-ins, protests, symbolic public acts, wearing a particular color, things that, without using violence, demonstrate a refusal to cooperate with unjust rulers and leaders. His work became particularly popular with democratic revolution movements during the Arab Spring. Sharp's work follows that of others, including Martin Luther King Jr. and before him, Gandhi, leaders who were willing to break the rules nonviolently to push towards a goal of justice for all people, freedom that all can share. We're not there yet. But we live in the hope that the work we continue to do as Christ followers in this congregation and many others pushes on the systems that maintain oppression and instead opens doors of freedom and justice for all people, particularly those who do not experience it right now. Sometimes we have to bend the rules, believing that in doing so, we are helping to bend the arc of the universe towards justice. Even though we know the right answer is Jesus, as it usually is, excuse me, when we talk about things biblical. The reality for us often, at least for me, is that the Pharisees' position is attractive. In these Mark verses about the Sabbath challenges, they're keeping things in check. They don't want to see things go off the rails. Their threshold for risk is low, mostly because they have found that the procedures and rituals they have been using are comfortable, enforceable, and they are working very well. Thank you very much. I think we can often relate to the Pharisees. They are holding the line on important rituals and practices that could easily disappear if there is not some accountability and strict adherence to the established rules around the Sabbath. I mean, let's be frank, Jesus is pushing the envelope here. This is not a situation where the disciples are starving, and were it not for the heads of wheat that they pluck, they would die. The man with the withered hand is not in a desperate situation that could not hold for a few more hours until the Sabbath were over. He doesn't even ask for healing. Yes, compassion is at play, and there's seemingly no other reason to delay those who can be fed and healed now. But this isn't a life or death situation. This is Jesus perhaps testing the Pharisees a bit, who ironically think they are testing him. In the words of theologian Wendy Farley, Jesus is not compelled to decide between life-saving actions and violation of a narrow and technical legalism. He's behaving with wanton disregard for simple and life-giving religious practices. By refusing to observe conventions for honoring the Sabbath, Jesus invites us into a terrifying form of faith in which time-honored practices are relativized by healing power, compassion, and joy. The rather terrible implication of this story is that normal and natural religious commitments can render us indifferent to human suffering and true community. Jesus is not saying there is anything wrong with Sabbath observance, but he was deeply grieved at their unyielding hearts. He was angered and frustrated, and he lamented their lack of attention to what actually deserved their energy and time and emotional investment. Instead of trying to catch him in the act of breaking the rules, which, by the way, Jesus was not trying in the least to hide, perhaps their attention, in order to truly live into the nature of the Sabbath, restoration and remembrance, would have been better paid to generosity and compassion and healing and gratitude. I think we here in this congregation do a good job of pushing the envelope sometimes, clearly demonstrating our open stance to an extension of God's love for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender or sexual identity, marital status, immigration status, etc. But I also wonder how we live into what is our norm, our tradition, our habitual practice in how we do church. And in what ways does that limit our ability to be fully present as God's love in the world? Is this very act of preaching and listening limiting? What about the pews on which we sit, or the appearance of our building from outside? Our expectations around what we do when we sing, when we pray, the types of music we use, the way we interpret the scripture, and our perspective on God's presence in the world. Do we create expectations and unwritten rules that we expect others to follow in order to join us and understand Jesus in the way that we do? Jesus seems to be demonstrating to the Pharisees in this Mark text that God is bigger and broader and more expansive than their understanding through human-defined ritual. And perhaps we should be listening for Jesus to tell us the same thing. God is greater than any way that our human minds attempt to understand God, and all we can do is our best, continually reminded that the Sabbath and other rituals and practices that we use to find connection with the sacred, to restore our souls, to feel the presence and movement of the Spirit, all of these are made for humans and not the other way around. I think Jesus is in some ways seeking a Sabbath of the Sabbath, seeking restoration and freedom for the actual practice of the Sabbath itself, so that it can live into its full purpose and thereby allow all people to live into theirs. One last thing I want to point out. I was taken by Jesus' request to the man to stretch out his withered hand. There was no obvious act of healing, nothing that Jesus particularly said or did, and I guess I'd think Mark might have included that if that level of detail were available. Stretch out your hand, Jesus says to the man. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Back in the Deuteronomy 5 text that explains the purpose for the Sabbath, I noticed that it says this: "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." Jesus invites the man to stretch out his hand, perhaps responding to God's strong hand and outstretched arm of freedom and healing. In the act of Sabbath, we reach for each other, divine and human, sacred and earthly, and we can find restoration and wholeness together in one another and in the freedom of God's grace and loving kindness. We have the opportunity to accept Jesus' invitation to reach out for healing, to reach out to others that need healing, to become disciples that learn from him and attempt to follow this way in the world. Sometimes that means bending the rules. May it be so.